really a super opportunity to be with all of you this evening. Just a brief background so that you know how I know anything about negotiation. I taught international negotiation for 12 years at a Swiss Federal Technical Institute. And I had a really fun class where basically the students negotiated every week. And the role play you're going to do tonight is one of the role plays we used in that class. It's been a little while since I've been through it, but I tweaked it for you. So I am very familiar with the play, and it will be a lot of fun. Being asked to present about negotiation in an hour isn't very easy because obviously, I'm sure most of you know that negotiation is a huge topic. I taught a 14-week class on it. You could easily spend your life studying negotiation. But what I chose to do this evening is to select a very specific aspect of negotiation that I have always found super interesting. And I thought you might find it interesting as well and benefit from being reminded about it. It may not be anything brand new to you, but it's always good to be reminded and to get a fresh perspective on something that you have heard of before. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see the slides I've prepared. And we'll get these up big. Where did we go? I don't want to go there yet. Go away, please. There we go. So we've got the art of creating and claiming value in a negotiation. And this is a little bit of a particular take on the larger topic of negotiation. So we'll get into this and see what it's all about. There we go. So the definition of negotiation that I have always liked and used is this one. Negotiation is a process, which I think is an important thing to keep in mind. It's not a one-off occurrence. It's something that can have many pieces and parts to it. Two or more parties can be involved. And one thing that we definitely want to keep in mind is that agreements come in different shapes and sizes. We want a desirable agreement, and the ideal would be that it's a quote unquote win-win for both sides. However, it needs to be acceptable for everyone. And that thing that we all know about negotiation is that it's a game of give and take. We all have to be willing to admit that we're not going to get everything we want. And if we go into a negotiating situation thinking that we're going to get everything we want, it's not going to go well, typically. The other part of this that's important to keep in mind is there has to be some level of common interest between these parties. You wouldn't come together in a negotiation if there weren't something in common. Obviously, people want different things in a negotiating situation, but it's good to keep in mind that at the bottom of it, there is this common thing that ties the parties together. That is not working for me. You're all aware that we negotiate in a variety of different contexts, and I'm sure many of you negotiate every single day. Most of us negotiate something every day, especially with this group down here, family and friends. But there are customers that we negotiate with. We think about, maybe it's a big customer negotiation, or it could be a small one, but suppliers, possibly creditors, our share and stakeholders are people that we negotiate with. There are those formal situations like a merger and acquisition or a joint venture, but daily we're negotiating with colleagues and team members in our work lives. So it's, I think, wise to keep in mind that we negotiate a lot. And even something that we might not be thinking of as a negotiation often is. Many of these negotiations happen somewhat spontaneously and we don't plan them, but it's a great idea to think ahead and have an idea of what you need and want out of an interaction. So characteristics, this is a little bit of a repetition of that previous slide, but we have these interdependent parties. The parties are somehow linked in this context. There's some type of conflict of interest. However, there is this common ground. So if we only focus on the conflict, as we're going to see a little further on in the presentation, that can present issues. We want to keep that common ground in mind. Negotiation is a form of influence. We want to influence the other party in order to get the best possible deal. And that's an interesting linguistic exercise if we think about language that we use in a negotiation. It also, the art of negotiation, or the task of negotiation, involves the management of both tangibles and intangibles. Sometimes people get overly focused on the tangibles, like the price, delivery dates, whatever that might be. But we need to keep in mind that sometimes the intangibles are what can move us forward, what can shift the landscape, what can get us what we need and want. So those intangibles are super important. I think it's interesting to consider that negotiation is generally voluntary. It's usually pursued by choice, not necessarily by force. Sometimes we consider arbitration the forced version of negotiation. But when we negotiate, we're usually doing it because we want to. It's also really great to keep in mind that it's a highly communicative activity. I taught negotiation at the Swiss university, where pretty much none of my students were mother tongue English. And it was super interesting to listen to their negotiations in English. Sometimes they would negotiate in French on me, but I would have to force them back into English because that was the exercise. But you do need to pay a lot of attention to the language you're using, and also the how of communication. When you say something, the timing, the tone, the intonation pattern can be super important. And I could talk all day about that because communication is my thing. We're not going to go deeply into that this evening, but there's a whole art of how you speak in a negotiation. The other thing about negotiation is that we do expect give and take. And when we get to looking at the two major negotiation styles, which we're going to do here in a couple of slides, we can see that we'll see that that give and take isn't always part of what people come to a negotiation with. Somebody might have that expectation and somebody might not. The other thing that I like to always talk about the word trust when I talk about negotiation. Good outcomes, and by good, I mean solid agreements that hang together and last and get a desired outcome for both parties, do require an element of trust. So when we are engaged in this process, we have to think about what behaviors build trust and what behaviors don't. And I'll have a story to tell about that a little bit later. So I've chosen to focus our conversation this evening on the comparison, if you will, or the juxtaposing these two styles of negotiation next to each other. What we commonly refer to as win-win, and then the less popular terminology of win-lose. We cannot call these win-win can be referred to as integrative negotiating. Win-lose can be approached as a distributive. You can use the word distributive. You can use the word zero-sum game. So there are lots of terms that can be used to define these two major strategies. But generally, when we negotiate, we're using some form of one or the other or both of these. And that's what I'm actually proposing this evening, is that we can learn to use both. And I'll say that in my international negotiation classroom, I always preached, if you will, that everyone should know both. Everyone should be able to enact both a win-win strategy and a win-lose strategy, because out in the greater world, we can't assume that people from other places will have the mentality and the mindset to enact win-win. Win-win gets a lot of praise. You will read that the outcomes are better. And actually, I have that slide in here too. And it's true. However, people from some realities simply aren't able to accept that everybody can win. and I saw this in lots of situations in my classrooms, but you'll see here the first point, win-win tends to be adopted or adoptable in cultures that have an abundant resource mentality, because in these realities, they believe that the pie can be enlarged, that it's possible to expand the pie out so that everybody can get something of what they want. Some realities, however, are scarce resource mentalities, and I can tell you that Southern Italy is one of these. A lot of places in the world are a scarce resource environment. In that case, it's very difficult for people from those realities to believe that the pie can be enlarged. In their world, the size of the pie is fixed, and they have this belief that if someone gains, someone loses. So for them to be able to view a negotiation as essentially a problem-solving exercise is impossible. Somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. So that is something to keep in mind. And a quick story, when I taught negotiation in Italy, I found that Southern Italians had a very difficult time accepting win-win. They would simply say, no way. Whereas Northern Italians had more of an ability to admit or accept that the pie could be enlarged. So this win-win is linked to problem solving, and it involves sharing a lot of information. That is something that people have to be willing and able to do. On the win-lose side, I'm sure you're familiar with warfare and adversarial language referring to negotiation. It's a fight. They're the us versus them mentality. And part of that strategy is withholding information. Now, I will say, as far as sharing information goes, it's also true that you shouldn't just lay all your cards on the table at the very beginning. That's simply naive. And particularly before you know the style of negotiation your counterparts are going to be able to enact. So there's something about holding some cards closer to the vest. However, as you build the trust, you need to be willing to then share a bit more information and share it in a, how can we say, a controlled manner. Maybe that's a word we can use. Another thing that's different about the two styles, in the win-win, we've got a negotiator who can see both parties' goals as being important, whereas in a win-lose mentality, people are more likely to be very, very focused on their own goals, and they don't really care about the goals of the other party. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail this evening about focusing on interests and not positions, but this focusing on positions and defending your positions at all cost is a little bit what I was referring to about behaviors that can really break trust or certainly not build it. And I've seen this backfire for people a lot of times in my classrooms. So this focus on position means that you're not focusing on relationship, and you have a mentality or an idea that you don't need the relationship. Now, obviously, in some circumstances, you don't need the relationship. There are what we call one-off types of negotiations where you're never going to see the party again. And in that case, it has been shown in research that you can actually get a better deal by being pretty tough. But in any case where ongoing relationship is important, and of course, in any type of internal negotiation within a company, this would be the case. In customer relationships and supplier relationships, you're going to need to value that relationship. In that case, positional bargaining and positional operation doesn't work at all, because it does not build trust. So typically in that win-lose scenario, people simply don't trust each other, whereas in a more win-win environment, we are working to build the trust. The ultimate goal in both cases, this win-lose, the ultimate goal is to win, which means the other side loses. This ultimate goal in win-win is what William Ury refers to as a wise agreement. And that wise agreement is agreement where both parties have been able to get their needs met. So we're going to move on to the topic for this evening, which is basically the idea that in many circumstances, we will use elements of both styles or both strategies of negotiation. The cooperative approach in this slide would be that win-win. The competitive approach would be the win-lose. But what we want to basically learn to do or consider doing is cooperate, use the more win-win approach as we expand the pie, because in order to expand that pie, we need the trust in order to exchange information. But when it does come time to finalize that agreement, it's not terrible to at that point become a little tougher and compete to get your best share of the pie. If you've built relationship and trust in the early stages, it's a little easier to do this without wrecking the relationship once you get to the point of dividing the pie. So this is what sometimes this is called coopetition, but it is this idea of learning to use both and learning when to use both strategies in a negotiation. This is the slide that helps us understand why these integrative agreements tend to be more durable, I guess we could say, and desirable. But if the parties' interests are reconciled, a high mutual benefit can be achieved. Now, in order for these interests to be reconciled, a great deal of communication has to go on. And that is where the role of communication becomes really important and crucial, is being able to get that trust enough to get the information out. These types of agreements tend to also expand out the bargaining zone. That means that through conversation and looking at interests, things that may not have initially seemed like they were issues or things that could be agreed come out in the conversation. And it gives more options. We're going to discuss something this evening called log rolling. And log rolling can also be referred to as horse trading, but it is that idea that you give to get. And the more items or issues you can bring to the table, the more trading can be done. And the more likely it is that both parties can get elements of what they've come for. These types of agreements tend to be more stable, simply because if somebody wins and somebody loses, that's extremely lopsided and somebody's unhappy. And if somebody's unhappy, that agreement can fall apart. They're not going to keep their end of the bargain because they feel like they got ripped off or cheated. So if we come to more equitable agreements, that means that they tend to be stable. Compromises, I want to just say a word about compromise. I lived for 8 years in Switzerland, and the whole Swiss culture is based on compromise. It's the coming to the middle to everybody gives up something. And that's not necessarily thought to be the best type of agreement, because again, somebody can be unhappy with what they had to compromise about. And in compromising, people can get backed into corners. They can feel like they don't have choices. So that's the reason that we don't necessarily want to just think about 50-50, the 50-50 compromise. It usually isn't the best agreement that we can come to. The idea also is that the sharing of information can strengthen relationships. So once this trust has been built and we share information so that we can reconcile interests, we are better friends. We know each other better. We may know things about each other's businesses that we didn't know before, or each other's departments or areas. And this can maybe come out, future collaboration might come out of that. So this is the reason we want to head toward those integrative types of agreements. There are a couple of different types of goals in negotiating. There is the individual attainment goal, and then there's the collective agreement goal. So each negotiator wants to claim a certain amount of the total value, but the most stable agreements are those where both parties' goals are satisfied. So we can't be so greedy as individual negotiators that we are ruining the opportunity for a collective agreement, a satisfying collective agreement to be reached. So we have to keep these two goals in mind every time we negotiate. The other piece, and I'm sure you've all heard of Pareto efficiency, you hear about it in a lot of different contexts. In the negotiation context, it means that if we come to a Pareto optimal agreement, there is basically no other agreement that makes either party better off without decreasing that outcome for the other. So it's that idea that we can't go one step further in either direction, or somebody's going to feel like they've lost out. So it's an interesting thing to think about as we negotiate, but basically the frontier looks like this. And of course, a Nash solution would be absolutely perfect, where everybody got exactly what they wanted. These agreements are actually quite rare. And if you look at research that's been done, most agreements are going to fall in this zone. And the closer they come to, the frontier, the more stable the agreements are going to be. So that's all I'm going to say about Pareto optimality. You can actually read a lot about it. It's quite interesting, and I always did teach it in the classroom. But it's that idea that we have this sort of frontier we can move toward. And as a negotiator, we're trying to come as close as we can while both parties still are feeling satisfied with the agreement. Does that make sense? It's a little technical, I know. This just explains why these types of Pareto optimal solutions are rare. And I put this slide in because there is a tendency, it's a human tendency. We're talking here about naive negotiators, but they're not the only ones who fall into the trap, I'm afraid. The idea of a fixed pie bias is seeing the task as a zero-sum game. So as human beings, we all have this tendency to think that things are a little more competitive than they really are. It's like we're attracted to negative media and negative messages because we're human. So this can be something that trips people up. And being a little bit aware of your own proclivity, like, do you tend to want to be really competitive in negotiations? Being aware of that can help you kind of pull back a bit and try to get to some of these other types of agreements that might be, you don't want to get in your own way, I guess is the best way of saying that. So this overuse of distributive tactics can distract negotiators. I think there's sort of a romantic idea of the swashbuckling negotiator who rides in on the horse with a sword, you know, and I had students like this all the time in my classrooms, and they would just be like, rah, yeah, man, we're going to win here. You can get distracted with that type of behavior and with that mentality when engaging in more integrative behaviors is going to get you a better deal. It's actually going to serve you more to not get so distracted with that competitive mentality. You can lose sight of the bigger picture, basically, if you work too hard at defending your own position. And I'm sure many of you have been involved in negotiations where you've watched somebody dig themselves a hole, and then it's very difficult to get out of that hole. I did have a student once who we always talked about starting softer and ending harder. You know, this whole idea that we're talking about this evening, this coopetition. I had a student decide to flip that on its head and start out tough and then get nice. And he actually figured out that that doesn't work well at all. He couldn't recuperate that relationship once he'd stuck his foot in it, basically. So the goal here, the overriding goal of the negotiation, is to maximize the joint value of the agreement. It's not as productive to look at what one side got versus the other side got, as to look at the entire agreement and see how balanced we can make it. So some of the key skills, if we want to develop this ability to claim value, these are some skills that we can work on. And as we know, negotiating is like the game of golf. You're always working on some aspect of your negotiating skill. The first thing is that you need to be familiar with and comfortable with using both strategies. Some people get trained in win-win and they don't really know the tactics of win-lose and vice versa. And so if you're locked into pretty much only being able to use one strategy, you don't have as much flexibility, and you do have a lesser ability to meet any negotiator anywhere. So I've always believed that being familiar with and able to use both strategies is a good idea. You also need to be able to identify situations that require more or less of one or the other approach. You could find yourself facing someone who you realize pretty early in the process doesn't have the ability to go to win-win. They're going to go to a win-lose strategy. And in that case, you're going to have to go there too, because it's very difficult to drag them into the win-win. So figuring out what kind of situations require more of the win-win, more of the win-lose. You want to avoid fixed pie bias. This is that self-awareness piece that we just talked about. If you know that you have a tendency for fixed pie bias, you want to work it out of yourself. And then the other piece here is focusing early on interests. And one thing I always found in my classrooms is that people don't really know what interests are. It's kind of difficult to define interests. So I'm going to take just a minute to talk about that. They're defined as the needs, desires, concerns, and fears of negotiators, of the parties. We talked earlier about, or I mentioned earlier, this tangible versus intangible. The thing that makes interests so slippery is they are often intangible, and they are also often implicit. They don't become explicit unless we really dig for them. So this is where careful question asking, careful listening comes in. You want to get people to talk about the why. Why do they want what they want? And that takes conversation, it takes trust to get people to expose that, to tell you what they really are feeling. And of course, in all circumstances, people make decisions based on their feelings. So if you can get a handle on these more intangible, touchy-feely, we can say, issues, it can help you then to speak their language and also help them understand how you can help them get what they want while you're still getting what you want. So these are some ways to uncover the interests. It's that ask yourself why. Put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself, why might they want what they want? You can also ask yourself the question, why not? What is standing in the way of your counterpart making the decision you want them to make? You might figure that out standing in their shoes, but you can also ask them. If you ask your counterpart with curiosity, as opposed to confrontation, what's in your way? Or why is it that you really want X issue or this thing that you really want? Why? Tell me more. This is the way you uncover those interests. And this is really what's at the bottom of expanding the pie. This is how the pie gets larger, because you discover these issues that were not necessarily obvious at the very beginning. But it does require a relationship and a trusting relationship to get to this conversation. There we go. So when we're talking about interests, we want to be explicit, specific, clear, and concrete, but flexible. So that's like not having a super confrontational style, but be asking very open questions and then listening carefully and maybe feeding that back or building upon what their answers are and what the information that they give you. You also want to give your interests and your reasoning before you get to the point of stating, in concrete terms what you want, your conclusions or proposals. These interests, if you want to get to their interests, your interests need to come out as well. Acknowledging their interests is always a great idea, letting people know that you've heard them and letting people know that you do consider their interests to be important. If you just kind of blow them off or, God forbid, say, no way, Jose, that's not going to lead to positive, constructive communication. The other idea behind interests is focusing on the future. some negotiations do take place in a context of a lot of past. Like if you're trying to, if you're negotiating something that went wrong and you're trying to negotiate, coming out of it and taking and fixing something, I guess. In that case, you want to hear what happened in the past, but not dwell on it, because you can get very stuck. Just you did, they did, you did, they did. That doesn't get anybody anywhere. So hear it, maybe even write it down and say, okay, we're clear. This is what happened. Now let's focus on the future. Now let's look at what interests we can explore that will take us to a better place, a better outcome, a better conclusion. And then this, I'm sure you've heard, it's very common in negotiation lore, this idea of being firm on the problem, but soft on the people. And that also can be an issue of language, interestingly. You want to minimize your use of you. We can be nice, they can be useful, but if you're constantly saying you did this, you did that, it can become, it can appear that you're picking on individuals as opposed to the issue at hand. So it's a matter of separating the issue from kind of who did it or who caused it. It happened, it's an issue, let's deal with the issue. So this idea that, hang on just a minute. Nope. I wanted to mention this log rolling technique, which is one of the things that it's useful to know how to do. I don't know why they call it log rolling exactly, because that makes me think of Paul Bunyan and, rolling down a river on these logs. But basically, it's the idea of trading. I'll give you this if you give me that. We can accommodate you here if you can accommodate us there. So you have to understand your own issues from the standpoint of differential importance. What do we want the most? And this is prioritizing, that's another word for it. But basically, you're willing to give something that is of lesser importance to you to get something that is more importance to you, of more importance to you. So if you can get this going where they're giving up something, you're giving up something, that's where the deal can be made. And the idea is that we're increasing the value for both parties. And that does, again, it requires communication. I was asked to speak a little bit this evening to the new world of virtual negotiation. And I did create a handout, which you're all going to get to take home this evening or download. That's the way that we're going to give it to you. And I had it here. Where did I put it? It's broken into these 4 areas, and I didn't want to just list slide after slide of this information, so I chose to give it to you to take away. But basically, I found this interesting that pre-COVID, only 10 to 15% of negotiations were carried out virtually, but now the expectation is that going forward, as many as 25% might be taking place virtually, because people have found that it can work. It does require effort, and it is not an easy thing to do. But so some of this early research from 2020, and this was Harvard research, did find that there were poor objective results and less trust was built between parties. My personal belief is that people have gotten a little better at this over time, and some of this may have been mitigated, but we all know that it is difficult to feel warm and fuzzy about people when you're not in the same room with them. So, and some of the advice that you'll find on that sheet, which I'm going to read you a little bit of it, is to have small talk. So you still need to be doing the small talk even if you're not in person. Sometimes negotiations can become protracted. There's less effective group decision making. All of this is to some degree how facile people are with the technology. If you really learn to use technology effectively, I think a lot of this can be mitigated. And then there can be a greater risk of misunderstanding, but this actually pertained to when somebody was trying to negotiate using only email. And frankly, I would never recommend that. I don't think that's a good idea. You can use email as one tool in a negotiation, but all of the recommendations that I read about in virtual negotiation say that from a technology standpoint, you need to use video. And the bigger the screen, the better. The more you can see of your counterparts, the better things are going to go. So the planning, and this is the document that you're going to receive. I'm just going to cover a couple things quickly here. In the planning, it recommends that you create a detailed agenda and that you involve your counterparty in that agenda creation exercise. Making sure that everybody gets input. Be sure to schedule breaks. And another recommendation for virtual negotiation is keep the sessions short. Break them up. An hour max, I would say 45 minutes could even be the top end of how long you would want a negotiating session to go on, because it's very, very tiring. It takes a lot more brain power and energy to do a virtual negotiation than it does one in person. So that is I think, very key piece of a very key recommendation. You want to be sure that everyone on your team knows what they're doing and that they have a clear assignment. Another piece of technical recommendation is to have something set up for your team that is not inside of the platform you're using for the actual negotiation to negotiate offline. So like, for example, tonight we're on Zoom, and if you were doing your negotiation on Zoom, you wouldn't want to be communicating with your team members in a back channel chat using the Zoom chat feature, because it's too easy that you don't hit the right button and the other side can see what you're talking about. So Slack, text, use some other form of back channel communication. And that was something I hadn't thought about, and I thought that was a really good recommendation. For the process, you want to avoid ragged starts. Make sure everybody's there before you get started. Definitely start with some getting to know and making sure everybody's okay. Creating breakout rooms for the teams when you take breaks is a good idea. So each team has a place to go and have a private conversation. So from a communication standpoint, regularly summarize, communicate super clearly, make sure that enunciation, pronouncing things clearly, because we all know how difficult virtual communication is from that regard. And another thing I thought was super interesting is this whole idea of silence. Both in person and virtually, we're quick to fill silences. I think silence in the virtual context can be a bit more uncomfortable, often because we don't know if maybe the technology stopped working and we're worried about that. So don't be afraid to let a silence sit there for a little while so that maybe your counterpart needs a moment to reflect. And we all know that you can talk yourself out of a deal pretty easily, or out of a sale. So you don't want to fill a silence. It might be to your detriment if you choose to fill that silence. So you will have that information as a takeaway, that list that I created from several different sources, and I'm sure you'll find that interesting.